about to hear a revolution in talk radio, Liberty Talk Radio, where the critical thinking will defrag your mind of propaganda-ridden viruses induced by mass media news programming. No BS here, just the facts.
And now we present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly. Wow. In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio, America's libertarian voice, broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. We are pleased today to have Mr. Marc Hyden as our guest. He's the National Advocacy Coordinator with conservatives' concerns about the death penalty. He comes most recently from the National Rifle Association, where he served as a campaign field representative in the state of Florida. We will be discussing the fairness of the death penalty. I'd say fairness. I think fairness and death penalty is tough to put together, but we'll try to do that. And specifically, the scheduled execution of Richard Glossip by lethal injection scheduled for Wednesday, September 16th of this year. Please join us in this discussion with your questions or comments during the live broadcast, 646-652-4620. Again, that's 646-652-4620. We look forward to hearing you. Marc, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, Marc, there you are. Oh, boy, you look so formal. I feel so Boy, you got.
Why didn't you wear a tie,
I haven't worn a tie in years.
We need to get some ties in here.
After 65, I gave away my ties. You look great. Thank you so much for being on our program.
Thank you for having me. And if you give me your address, I'll mail you a tie.
Thank you so much. Well, Marc, I can't think of a subject. I guess only religious ideology conflicts that people have when they discuss religion. This has to be only second to that. Other than that, there is no issue that is more wrought with belief systems, with false paradigms than the death penalty itself. And I tell you, I'm actually hungry to hear what you have to say. Why you guys not advocating the death penalty for all these bad people we have out there?
Well, there's a lot of different reasons why conservatives especially would oppose the death penalty. We're not just talking about bad people. Innocent people get caught up in the system with regularity.
Right.
Over 150 people have been wrongly convicted, sentenced to death, and later released, while many others have been executed when there were serious doubts regarding the veracity of their verdict. But if you move beyond that, you see that this is a system that costs more than its alternatives, and it's even led to tax increases. But what do you get for this high human and fiscal cost? You really don't get anything. It harms murder victims' family members because of the length of the proceedings and the constant media attention, and it doesn't even protect the general public because it doesn't deter crime. This is just a big broken government program.
Yeah, I'm surprised because conservatives typically invoke religion in their rhetoric. I mean, this has been my experience. Not everyone, but generally speaking, you'd find conservatives to invoke religion more so than than liberals and whatever. And yet, one of the precepts of any religion is "Thou shalt not kill," and I often thought that was kind of a contrarian situation with conservatives, in that they are religious on one end, or more religious, or they speak more religiously on one end, and yet generally speaking the conservatives are for the death penalty, and there seems to be a conflict there. Am I way off base, or am I speaking about what the real world is like?
Well, the world's changing, and I've witnessed this. I speak to a lot of Tea Parties, conservative groups, and Republican clubs, and I see that the conversation is changing across the United States. We're looking at this program through the lens of our conservative principles, and we see that it doesn't line up. But you mentioned Christianity. I'm a Christian. I'm very proud of it, and I grew up the son of a minister. But when I ask myself, what would Jesus do? It's not execute people. That's not the first thing that comes to mind. And you're right, thou shalt not kill. That's a pretty central commandment in the Ten Commandments. But if we look at the Old Testament's mandates about the death penalty, there's actually 44 mandates in the Bible governing capital punishment. But I want to encourage people to actually read in between the lines. You're allowed to execute people who commit adultery, who don't keep the Sabbath, or even bankers who lend money at high interest rates. And that one may be okay for some people in America, but many people would be executed that we really wouldn't want to execute based upon the Old Testament death penalty. So I don't think this is something we'd want to see turn into a policy document. For me, the Bible is a personal moral compass instead.
Right. Well, my readings of the death penalty, I was always under the impression that someone was sentenced to death, and that Thursday, bingo, the person was put in, electrocuted, and it was over. But I learned that from the time that a person is adjudicated guilty and sentenced, to the death penalty, it takes years. And I forgot what the dollar amount is, but it's a phenomenal amount of money and time before, after the verdict, and the time that the person is actually executed. And during that period of time, the families go through more torture because the person is still alive, not executed, and they're in this limbo, and they say that's the true hell of the entire verdict, is that limbo period. And in many cases, the person who is being the attorneys that are defending the person being executed or accused typically are the poorer people who can't afford the high-powered attorneys and are assigned an overworked general prosecutor, and as a result, they don't get the attention. And in fact, in many cases, I've read cases where people have come to court totally unprepared to defend their client, totally unprepared, and the person is then sentenced to death and really had no defense whatsoever. Now, is my readings about what your experience has been?
You touched on a lot of very valid points. The death penalty process, the appeals process, can take 12 years, 20, 30 years as well. But it's in place for a good reason. Because many people have been found to be wrongly convicted and sentenced to death, and it takes decades sometimes for them to be released. Of all the people that were exonerated last year, it took an average of 30 years for them to be released from death row. So it's there for a reason, but it's very harmful on murder victims' friends and family members because they have to relive some of the worst moments of their lives over and over again through the different appeals hearings and also the media attention that comes along with capital cases. But the state doesn't always think about their well-being when they seek a death penalty case or they seek a death sentence. I met a very nice lady in Indianapolis whose father was a minister who was murdered, but he opposed the death penalty. And he told his daughter if he were ever to be executed, if he was ever to be murdered, make sure the offender was not executed. Yep. Well, she got called to court to serve as a witness. And she got threatened by the state on the way to court. They said, if you say that you're against the death penalty or that your father was against the death penalty, we will throw you in jail and hold you in contempt of court. So this fiction about the death penalty being there for murder victims' friends and family members, I just don't buy into it. Right.
It almost seems to be the altruistic way to go. When someone kills another person and we want revenge, and I guess all that's really wrong. I mean, if you are moral, forget about being religious. If you're moral, it just doesn't hold any water. What I think is interesting is that even if you were for the death penalty and you felt it was righteous and whatever, when you come to think of it, the death penalty is kind of an easy way out. I mean, if a person committed a heinous crime, what you're doing is you're putting a person to sleep a little early in life. except for myself, everyone's going to die someday. I'm going to live forever because I'm so bad, But we all only have a certain time on this planet, and all we're doing is taking away maybe 5, 10. It could be that we're taking no years away from a person may be ill and may die next year. So all we're doing is taking away a short period of time out of their lives and basically putting them out of misery. It doesn't seem to be much of a penalty. I mean, when you look at it that way. Now, if you wanted someone to pay, put them in a cell, in solitary confinement for the next 20 years. I mean, that would be truly hell on earth. To me, the death penalty is an easy way out, but it makes certain people feel good about it.
Well, first of all, I'd like to know your secret for eternal life. So share that with me after the show. But beyond that, it's hard for me to say which is worse, life without parole or the death penalty, because I've never experienced either, and I hope that I never do. But I can tell you that Pennsylvania, they've only executed 3 people in the modern era, and those 3 were actually volunteers for execution. They wanted to get it over with. They wanted to move on, I guess, to the next life. Right. So it depends on the individual. Certainly others don't want to be executed. I can't imagine that I would want to be, but jail's not a good place. So there's no good option there, but we can implement better programs. We could, as Bill O'Reilly suggested, we could implement life without parole where the offender actually has to work to pay restitution to the murder victim's friends and family members. And I think that's a much more just program.
Oh, absolutely.
And you don't risk killing an innocent person.
Right. I mean, a person has to pay their way in prison, or they starve to death, or whatever they do. They have to do something. Don't make it pleasant for them. I mean, don't give them a basketball court, widescreen television. Geez, that sounds good. I think I want to go to jail, But don't give them all these amenities and have them reflect on what they've done. I mean, that to me has got to be pure hell for the person, and that's a lot more punishment than just basically putting someone to sleep, basically forever.
Sure, and there's a lot of misconceptions about what jail is actually like. We hear about these country clubs and basketball courts and cable TV, but that's generally federal prisons that are like that. The state prisons where many of these people go to live on death row or life without parole are not like that. Right. And I actually read a study that came out from the Bush administration, and I believe in 2009, it came out the year after his administration ended, that suggested that more men were raped than women for the first time in history, and that was directly correlated to the prison population in the United States. So prison, in most cases, is not cushy. It's not a nice place.
Yeah. Now, I would assume, being a conservative, you're on the Republican side of the ticket. Am I correct, or shouldn't I ask that question?
I don't mind telling you. I mean, I identify as a conservative and not as a Republican, but I've never voted any other way.
Okay. Well, then you've got to be in the minority in that political sphere.
Well, things are changing. There's still a large number of people that support the death penalty, and I think it depends how you ask the question. If you ask someone, do they support the death penalty in theory, you're going to get a lot of people that support it, because you can make a compelling case that perhaps some people deserve to die. But when you change the question, do you trust an error-prone government to fairly, efficiently, and properly administer this program, then the conversation changes. Yeah. And if you give an alternative of what to sentence people to instead of the death penalty, you see the numbers drastically changed. In North Carolina, 68% of North Carolinians said they support repealing and replacing the death penalty with a system of life without parole, where the offenders have to work to pay restitution. And the majority of those who were polled were self-described conservatives. Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you a number, and I'm sure it's wrong. 36 states have have done away with the death penalty. Am I about right? How off am I? 31 states still have it on their books. Okay. However, last year, I believe it may have been only 9 that actually used their death penalty. Yeah. So really, it seems like it's going in the direction of doing away with is a terrible word to say on radio, but doing away with the death penalty. Sure. Now, tell us about the Glossip case. Walk us through that one, and where is it right now? Well, the Richard Glossip case has many hallmarks that we see in many wrongful convictions. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime of which he was convicted and sentenced to death for. And then it relied on the testimony of one person who testified in order to plead down to a lesser penalty. So what happened was Richard Glossip was the manager of a hotel in Oklahoma. And his boss, the owner of the hotel and a few other hotels, was in town. Well, he was unfortunately murdered while he was staying at that hotel. And the police looked at Richard and thought that he might be a suspect, although they had no evidence to suggest that he was. And he told the police that a man named Justin Sneed had actually admitted to him that he had murdered Barry Van Treese, who is the owner. So when the police picked up Sneed, he admitted to the crime. He said, yes, he went in and he used a baseball bat and killed Barry. So what he did from there is, supposedly there's a video that hasn't been shown to any jury, but it shows that the police were actually spoon-feeding Justin information so that he would not only admit to the crime, but implicate Glossip in it as well. So he stated that Glossip talked him into killing Barry Van Treese because he was afraid that he may get fired from his role as manager of the hotel. Sneed said that Glossip had offered him $10,000 to carry out this murder. But again, there is no evidence to suggest this. Everybody knows that Sneed committed the murder. Everybody knows this. And everybody knows that, and he was never even accused of, Glossip wasn't of actually committing the murder. They just said that he might be the mastermind. So he was convicted on this through 2 trials because he had inept attorneys. And now we're at the place where, as you said, in September, he's got an execution date. But we're asking, many people are asking for a reprieve from the governor for 60 days so that his new attorney can go try to find individuals who may have witnessed the crime, and also to cross-examine and interview Sneed, who may be changing his story. Supposedly his daughter even wrote a letter to the governor stating that her father has been talking about changing his story to finally tell the truth. So this is the place that we're in right now.
Well, when there is evidence suggesting that there's a question about the behavior of the parties involved, isn't that enough to withdraw the death penalty from the table altogether? Because at least there's some sort of reasonable doubt that there may be something askew, and that it's not a matter of 5 people looking at somebody shooting another person or killing another person in cold blood, and there's prima facie evidence that this person, and on camera and whatever, that the person was killed. This is all sort of hearsay. And why would the governor not say, hey, get this thing off the table, get this thing right, and then decide on a verdict?
Well, unfortunately, the governor in Oklahoma statutorily is not allowed to take people off of death row, so she doesn't have that power. The only power she has is to give a 60-day reprieve, which is what the attorneys are asking for in his case. But you touched on, why would someone be sentenced to death with absolutely zero physical evidence and using the testimony of one person who was very biased? This happens frequently, and this is unfortunate. This often happens because of poor criminal defense attorneys that are defending these individuals. But when it comes to the appeals process, it exists just to see if the offender received a fair trial. It's often really, really hard to introduce new evidence, exculpatory evidence that would lead to the release from lead from their release from death row. So it's a very complex and difficult system, and unfortunately the burden of proof shifts in appeals cases to where the defendant actually has to do a lot of the proving that they're there wrongly.
Now, I understand that if you are wealthy enough, you will never get the death penalty. If you are poor, you stand a good chance of getting the death penalty. True or false?
Well, that's very true. There are a few things you can look at to give you a good idea of whether or not the prosecutors are going to seek a death penalty, and that's the race of the victim. A white victim who's murdered by an African American, there's a much higher likelihood that they will be sentenced to death. But it's also economic. If they can afford their own private criminal defense attorney, the odds are they're not going to be executed. But if they have to rely on a court-appointed attorney, that usually doesn't turn out very well. These people are overworked, underpaid, and often pretty inexperienced.
Right.
So there's a lot of pitfalls surrounding the death penalty with regards to economic standing.
Yeah, I've read articles, and again, there's no way for me to qualify the article at all, but of a neophyte assistant district attorney going in there and defending. And maybe his first case or second case, and he's overloaded, and defending someone who may get the death penalty. Well, this person is on the short end of the stick. I mean, there's a good possibility that this person is either going to jail unjustifiably or getting the death penalty because there's no one really to truly defend them.
Yeah, and I actually remember one case. I forgot what state it was, so I don't remember off the top of my head, but they needed to find at random an attorney to defend a client who was going to be sentenced to death, and he was sentenced to death. So they opened up the phone book and randomly put their finger down, and wherever that landed, that was the attorney they were going to allocate for his case. Well, it turned out it was an insurance attorney who had never practiced criminal law before, and it didn't turn out very well because, again, this capital cases are not only are they more different than any other in the criminal justice system, but they're much different than insurance law as well. So, you need good defense to have a fighting chance.
Why does not the judge, during the trial or before the trial, look at the situation and say, well, this person is a wealthy individual, has a team, not one, but a team of high-powered, experienced attorneys, defending this side of the aisle, and on the other side, they have an overworked, like you said, underpaid and inexperienced young district attorney who is assistant district attorney who's defending the person, and why can't the judge see this inequality and say, hey, this isn't fair, Why don't the judges take a more proactive approach in that regard and say, when we find a person that's qualified to defend this person, because we may be talking the death penalty, and we don't want to trust the death penalty to someone who's going to spend 15 minutes total on the entire case, when another person has 4 or 5 attorneys, top-notch attorneys, that may spend literally hundreds of hours on the case. Cannot the judge? Can't the system detect that and say, when we equal the both sides are quite equal, then we'll have a trial?
Unfortunately, not to my knowledge. This went up to the Supreme Court in the past, where they decided that yes, you do have a right to counsel. You don't have a right to good counsel. Right. So that's what the Supreme Court has ruled. So as long as there's an attorney, or actually it's a mandate now that they have at least 2 attorneys, that's all they really are required to do. But we've heard of stories of these defense attorneys showing up to court drunk. Some of them fell asleep. Right. And others, they in the past have not even called any witnesses. Right. So, as long as they have an attorney, apparently that's all that's necessary.
Yeah, and I've read cases where the attorney, the defense, actually read the charges or became familiar with the charges in the courtroom. I mean, they came in with a file, opened it up, read it, and say, okay, and that's the only research that person has done, or that's the entire knowledge of the case that he has, is what he read in a couple of paragraphs right before the trial, where the other side may have had attorneys working on it for a month or 2.
Well, capital cases, before they go to trial, are usually investigated for months. A lot of man hours go into this. So when a defense attorney shows up unprepared, it's not going to bode well for them. Not everybody gets an F. Lee Bailey. Not everybody gets a Johnny Cochran. You get some of these inexperienced and poor attorneys, and we've seen many wrongful convictions that have come from poor defense. You can look at Ray Crone, who's a Tennessee conservative, but he was sentenced to die in Arizona mainly because he had a defense attorney who didn't question any of the state's evidence and didn't ask for the evidence that they didn't turn over in discovery. So he was sentenced to death based on bogus forensic testimony regarding bite mark analysis, which has since been shown to be completely unscientific. But the district attorney had been withholding evidence which would have probably prevented his conviction. So it took over 10 years for Ray to prove that he was sentenced to death wrongly. And now he's since been released, and he travels and tries to share his message with the world.
Yeah. Do you have problems when you discuss this with Christians, saying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth type thing, and the whether or not, not from a legal point of view, but from a moral point of view, that the death penalty is immoral? Do you ever have those discussions, and what kind of responses do you have to get for that?
Well, I spoke at Campbellsville University, a Baptist college, recently in Kentucky, and I did have some questions. Without fail, someone always brings up the Bible to justify their support for the death penalty. And, as we talked earlier, you need to know what the Bible actually says before you try to use the Bible as justification for something. But people always bring up eye for an eye, but you need to understand what eye for an eye is. It means, Joe, if you were to come kill me, that means that my family can't kill your whole family and everybody you've ever met in revenge. They can only do what's proportional back. At most, they could execute you. But eye for an eye is not a mandate. It just says that you can't go beyond that act of proportionality. So it's important for people to understand that. But I think if we're Christians, we need to focus on the New Testament as well. It was Jesus who actually stopped the execution, the stoning of the adulterer, and said, "Those without sin cast the first stone."
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
So I think we can learn from that.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it just seems to be, especially from conservatives who invoke the Bible, it seems too often, in my opinion, and unfortunately, because I think they misquote it, they misuse it, they misapply it, and they used to justify their position. And those are the ones you think that would be most opposed to the death penalty, and they're not. And I think that's a real contrarian type situation. Now, are you an attorney, by the way?
I'm not. I actually come from a family of attorneys, and I decided I wanted to go into politics instead. So no, I'm not going through law school.
Okay, all right. Well, neither am I, as you can tell. All right. Now, the organization that you're with, tell us a little bit about that organization and what it is doing and what kind of progress you're making.
Well, we are conservatives concerned about the death penalty. We launched in 2013 at CPAC, which is the largest gathering of conservatives in the world. It was an amazing experience. I used to work for the NRA, but when I came to work for Conservatives Concerned to launch the organization, I was a little worried about how my peers might accept me. I was used to being the darling of the crowd as a pro-Second Amendment activist, so I was concerned. But it was great. We were inundated by supporters who asked us where we had been for so long. I've had people drop everything in their hands, rush up, and ask if they could hug me even. I'm not a big hugger, but I always say yes. We've had others cry when they see us because they're so happy. So we're finding that there was a void where nobody was having a discussion, a forum about the death penalty for conservatives. So we filled that void. And since then, I've seen a marked change across the United States. More and more conservatives are coming out against the death penalty. You saw Nebraska as the first red state in 40 years to repeal the death penalty, and we were active there. And we're seeing people like Dr. Ron Paul, Colonel North, Michael Steele, the former RNC chairman, Richard Vigor and Jay Sekulow, and many others taking a stand and saying, we don't support this big, broken government program that risks innocent life. We're pro-life, so we don't want to support a program that risks killing the innocent. Right. So it's been an amazing experience, and we saw just in the past year, there's been a 5% shift among Republican support for the death penalty, which is larger than the past 19 years combined.
Yeah. Well, Mark, could you hold on for about a minute, and we need to break for station identification? Okay, stay with us. Folks, don't go away. We need our sponsors to say a few words, and stay with us, please. We'll be right back. Thank you.
You're listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Political talk derived from a historical perspective. Not always palatable, but good food for thought. Pure libertarian talk with host Joe Cristiano. LibertyTalkRadio.com.
Express Test is your go-to company for on-site occupational health testing services. That's right, we said on-site. That means we will meet you at your facility for a free health and occupational safety consultation. Express Test specializes in hearing conservation, respiratory protection, and employee safety. We can help you establish viable programs tailored to your business and employee needs. For your free consultation, call 918-743-2929 or visit us at expresstest.com. That's 918-743-2929 or expresstest.com. Do you find yourself asking, what did you say? Aaron Cristiano of Ranch Acres Audiology has over 25 years of experience helping patients just like you.
Hearing requires conservation. We need to be aware and we need to be responsible for our own hearing health.
Understand more with a little help from Ranch Acres Audiology. Call 918-749-7711. That's 918-749-7711 to learn more. We'd like to thank Attorney Constance Squires for her support of Liberty Talk Radio. If you want a comprehensive way to affordably avoid legal issues, call Constance Squires. For a free consultation, call 918-254-9283 or go online at isthyWillDone.com.
Steve Harden of the Harden Insurance Agency has over 30 years of experience designing family insurance protection, including retirement planning. Call 918-488-0024 or go to hardenagency.com and request a free in-depth estate and retirement evaluation. We look forward to earning your trust and helping you meet your life goals.
This isn't your typical talk radio show. This is Liberty Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. With us, we have Marc Hyden. He's an advocacy, a conservative, the advocacy for the elimination of the death penalty. And we're here talking about the Glossip case, where Mr. Glossip is scheduled to be executed this coming September 16th, for a crime he most likely did not commit, or they really can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he committed. So we're talking about the death penalty, its fairness, and whether or not we should even have a death penalty here in the United States, period, whether it be morally, legally acceptable. Right? Is he on the phone?
Yeah, he's there.
Is he? I don't see him.
Oh, well.
Okay, there he is. Okay, I thought you went bye-bye on me.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay. Well, what's going to happen with the Glossip case now?
Well, it's kind of sit and wait. We're trying to get messages through to the governor. I know the attorneys are working every avenue they possibly have, but they need to find witnesses for a crime that happened, I believe, in 1996. So many of those witnesses are now dead, and some of them they just can't find. But it'd be nice if the governor would just give a 60-day reprieve so that the person who actually committed the murder can be cross-examined and can be interviewed to see if perhaps he's willing to now change his mind, change his story like he told his daughter that he's considering. So if we do that, perhaps through the appeals process or perhaps through action from the governor, Glossip may have a chance to prove his innocence or prove that he was at least wrongly convicted. In my mind, there's just not enough evidence to convict someone. And I'm under this strange notion that if you're going to execute someone, which I don't believe in executions, you should probably be sure of their guilt. But I don't believe they've reached that threshold. I don't even think they're remotely close to that threshold. And in fact, they know who committed the murder because he admitted it. The only reason he's there is because the person who committed the murder implicated Glossip in the scheme in order to secure a life without parole sentence instead of the death penalty.
Right. Well, I'm going to get political on you for a second because I'm typically very apolitical, but it just bothers me that the United States should be the land of individual liberty and fairness. And here we are. We're a country that incarcerates, 25% of the incarcerated population of the world is in the United States. And we think nothing. It seems that we become almost callous to it. Think nothing about sending drones or aircraft over sovereign countries, bombing areas where we suspect someone to be a terrorist or an Al-Qaeda operative, or however you want to call it, a terrorist maybe, but not proven, but suspected, but we'll bomb an area and, 14 men, women, children got killed, but that's just collateral damage. That doesn't count. And it seems we've become immune as a nation, to killing. And then what grabs me about so many Republicans is they talk about the sanctity of life, and abortion. And they had this big abortion debate. Well, I'm not for abortion. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to kill anybody. But, on one hand, we talk about the, aborting a fetus that may be 2 days old, a glop of cells, and we make this big to-do about it, but someone who's not truly that we can find truly guilty of a crime, we'd love to snap to judgment and execute that person. Even if the person was guilty, we should take the opposite approach and say, what happened to the sanctity of life? Why don't we, the person, pay for their sins, but we're not God. We should not be condemning someone else to death. I just have a big hang up about. It seems like we're a nation that loves to kill. I mean, killing is good almost. And it just bothers me that we've somehow gravitated to this type of mentality. And I don't know if it's just bugging me, or do you feel that we do have a problem in that regard?
Well, I speak at a lot of conferences, so you're not alone. People are very concerned and upset about the direction of the United States, especially when it comes to the different forms of killing that they're involved in. Now, drones are outside of my purview, and I would be a little ignorant to actually get into a philosophical debate about them. But you mentioned the tough-on-crime mindset that kind of sparked the death penalty and sparked our over-incarceration. And a lot of that started in the 80s and 90s. And we thought that being tough on crime would prevent crime. We thought that it would be good for the murder victims' friends and family members and victims of other crimes. But we're finding out that these systems, this mindset of the 80s and 90s has been disastrous. You can look at all the wrongful convictions. You can look at the over-incarceration rates. And you can see how expensive this program is and the risks that it poses. And you also mentioned collateral damage with regards to drones. You can still apply that to the death penalty. People who tell me that they support the death penalty for the very guilty, the most heinous, which they usually don't get executed anyway, I ask them if they're willing to execute those people and realize that the death penalty and governments are mistake-prone, then you have to be willing to accept some collateral damage. So how many innocent people are you willing to murder in order to execute a few guilty people?
Right.
I don't think there's a good answer there, but many of our Catholic allies, they don't believe in the death penalty even for the guilty because they value life, a very high value. They view humans as, in the image of God, and they're not beyond redemption. We've seen a lot of people that have done wonderful things after they had committed heinous acts, and they become Christians, they become ministers, and they've done many wonderful things. So a person's life in total shouldn't be defined by one crime, but the totality of all of their life's acts.
Yeah, and we have to consider also the people associated with a person being wrongfully executed. I mean, this person usually has may have children, a wife, an extended family, and all these people for the rest of their lives, they suffer the agony, of a wrongful execution. And it's almost as if you're executing the entire family because they, for the next how many years they have left on this earth, they live with that feeling of guilt, not being able to help their loved one who they feel was innocent in the first place. And those are the people who truly suffer that had nothing to do with this alleged crime.
Well, they also suffer, that's true. They live through the same uncertainty that many murder victims' friends and family members go through because they don't know when their loved one may or may not be executed. And they also, because the media attention, people are going to realize that who they're related to, and they're going to carry a stigma for the rest of their life. But there's another group of people who are affected by the death penalty that frequently they get ignored, and that's corrections officers. They, in essence, they live with these people on death row for much of their lives, and they care for them. They're their stewards, and they nurse them back to health when they're sick, and they become friends. And then one day they're told they need to go kill their friend.
Right.
This is very harmful, and it's led
Never
to
thought of that.
PTSD. There's one warden, I believe, from Florida who frequently would wake up and he would see on the edge of his bed all the men that he had executed. And he's now very against the death penalty for a multitude of reasons. So the death penalty is harmful on a whole host of individuals, not just murder victims' friends and family members, and not just the family members of the convicted.
Isn't the several years, sometimes 10 to as many as 20 years, where a person is serving in the federal penitentiary awaiting the death sentence, isn't that a lot more punishment than the death sentence itself?
You know, I mean, that's kind of a subjective statement, so it's really hard for me to weigh in on that. But I wonder how that affects people on death row, because many people come within a day or two of being executed, and then they're told, oh, you got a stay of execution because something came up in the legal process. And you can look at the case of Kelly Gissendanner in Georgia, where I live. She came within a day of being executed, but it snowed here, and embarrassingly, we don't handle snow very well in Georgia, so the execution was actually snowed out. So then they set up a new date for her to be executed, but they noticed that the drugs looked cloudy, so they had to do another stay of execution. So I can't imagine what goes through these people's minds when they come so close to being executed, then they're told, we're going to wait for an undetermined amount of time before we try to execute you again. And Kelly is actually a good story of redemption. She's become a Christian, become saved, and she ministers to her fellow inmates now.
Well, would it not be fair for those few people, and there's not thousands every year, but the few people who are in fact adjudicated guilty, I guess is the word, but should they not, and then sentenced to death, should they not be given an experienced attorney to review the work of the prior attorney that may have been very experienced and report back to the court and say, yes, reviewing this, it seems that everything that was done could be done and that the evidence presented is fair? I mean, is there no, can the court assign a very experienced, successful attorney to ensure that the person is in fact guilty? If anything,
they're gonna assign a attorney, not necessarily an experienced and very expensive attorney, since this is paid for by the state. And the state, when it comes to the death penalty, the largest portion of the costs actually come from the initial trial, which is, you know, millions of dollars sometimes, whereas a life without parole case may be in the neighborhood of $70,000 to $100,000 for the prosecution. So no, they could, but they don't look for the most experienced and the best attorney. But they do review these cases, and 68% of all capital cases are overturned on appeal and required to go through the process again. So they have to go through multiple trials, sometimes three or more trials they go through, but still, you can look at Glossip's case. He got a retrial as well, but they still found him guilty based on flimsy evidence at best. Actually, no evidence, just the testimony of one person who was very biased.
Well, I have to question the jury. I mean, they know this is a life and death case. They don't have hard evidence. How does a jury come up to that particular verdict?
And that's a good question. And, you know, Joe, people like me and you, we're not allowed to serve on these juries because they'll ask us, do we support the death penalty? If we say no, we're not allowed to serve on that jury. We'll be struck immediately. So it's not exactly a jury of your peers. They're already biased and supportive of the death penalty.
I did not know that.
Yes,
I did not know that.
There's a major problem in that respect immediately. But then, if you look a little further, the people who are on the jury, they're only allowed to know pretty much what the prosecutor and the defense attorney allow them to know, and prosecutors have been known in the past to withhold evidence. And like I said, in the Glossip case, he had inept criminal defense attorneys. So, you know, they're given, you know, a very small piece of information to try to make a decision on whether to execute or not. And I think there's enough lack of evidence that, at least in Glossip's case, they should go back and see if, did they really have enough to sentence him to die? I don't think so.
Now, it would have to be unanimous, would it not?
Oh, unfortunately, no.
No, I didn't know that. I did not know that.
Some states, including Florida, allow a simple majority consent to execute someone, whereas other states, it's a little bit higher, but most require unanimous. But there's a handful of states, Delaware, Alabama, and Florida, that don't require unanimous jury consent, which is very unnerving, because you should be quite sure, if you're planning on executing someone, that they're guilty and they deserve to receive a death sentence.
Well, I would imagine that if the person was the person being accused is a person of color, the people, the jury, would have to at least be somewhat represented by people of color. Is that usually the case, or is in many cases they just have a white jury and, let's say, a black victim defendant, for example?
Well, it's funny you bring that up. I had this discussion with one of my colleagues recently, and in the past, people have come across manuals that prosecutors had where it said strike African Americans from juries so that it'd be easier to get a death sentence. So they're not represented in any sort of fair, equitable way. But now, you're not allowed to strike someone from juries just because of their race. So they come up with other ideas. In the past, one excuse for striking someone from a jury was that they didn't like his pointy New York shoes.
Well, I can understand that. God, oh my God, I can't believe it. I'm sorry I interrupted you. I had to say something.
Oh, no. I mean, that's the truth of it. I don't know if you've ever served on jury duty. When they found out that I was the son of a criminal defense attorney, I was struck immediately by the prosecution because they thought that I wouldn't be biased. But like I said, I could never serve on a capital jury because, I would be opposed to it from the start.
Yeah, I haven't been asked in, I think, 40 years. I haven't been asked to be on the jury, which is strange. I don't know why I have never been, but probably 45 years.
Have you done a jury duty, though?
What?
Were you at?
I have been asked to be on jury duty. I went there, I was interviewed.
So you did go.
Yeah, I did go in the whole bit, but I've never been asked back, and I can't figure out why.
You can go in my stead if you'd like.
Oh, I think I'd have some fun, but I mean, I don't know. Now, are there many juries that convict say a person of color, and the jury is all white, for example, and is that brought up as maybe a biased decision?
You could definitely look at it that way. I think that in capital cases, more than likely, they're going to try to get an all-white jury if the victim was white, and try to get an all-male jury if at all possible, because I believe males tend to support the death penalty on average at higher levels than females do. And then I believe they're hoping that if they're white, they're going to relate better to the victim and perhaps try to approve a death sentence based upon that. And, again, is that a jury of their peers? Not really. Is it fair and equitable? No.
No, you would think that the jury would have to be made up of, are there 10 or 12 people on a jury? I forgot what the number. 12? Yeah. Is it 12 people?
12.
You think of the 12 people, they would have 4 female, 4 people of color, and 4 white males or something like that. It's some combo, and it would be more fair. I mean, you could imagine if a person is a person of color, and then you have 12 white people from the deep South. There may be a bias there. I'm not casting dispersions. I'm just saying that it just doesn't feel right. That there should be a cross-section of America representing, the people, basically, against a person who purportedly committed a crime. But we don't do that, do we?
Well, as a white person from the Deep South, I'm not at all offended by by those comments.
Well, you know what I mean. Yeah,
I agree with you. The juries are not necessarily representative of the society, which you would think that it should be able to. And there are many excuses that can be used to strike someone from juries or other reasons to keep them on. And unfortunately, race does play a factor in this. Lady Justice, she's supposed to be blind, but apparently she's not colorblind, and we see this quite frequently, and it's a big problem because it should be fair and equitable. It should be equal regardless of race. But these are factors that play into this, and unfortunately, I think we've learned that many people can't separate race with some of their other decisions, and that goes along with seeking the death penalty and approving it if you're on a jury.
Yeah. Right now, we're focusing on the Glossip case. How many are in queue, basically, for execution at this time?
Nationwide, there's over 3,000 people on death rows across the United States waiting for the death penalty. However, the overwhelming majority of those people will never be executed because, I believe 800 of them reside in California alone, and they just don't execute people. They spent $4 billion on their death penalty program, and they've executed 13 people. So the system is so messed up there that a judge actually said that it was unconstitutional because they're sentencing people to die, but they're not executing them ever, so they never actually receive their punishment. But then there's other states that execute much more frequently, like Texas, like Oklahoma, Arizona, and Florida. But they have a much smaller percentage of people that are sitting on death row. It's the larger number in many of these states that don't actually use it.
Yeah. What is the national cost of the death penalty? I don't know how to put parameters around that, but those people who are waiting and going to be retried in this 10 or 20 year wait, and while they're in jail, obviously that's a cost involved also, because it's not that they are convicted on Thursday and then on Friday they're executed, and the only cost is the execution. They, as you said, they may wind up spending 10 to 20 years in jail, and that's a cost to the state. And then when you consider the number of years that the person's going to live beyond that is probably relatively small compared to his current life, how long he's lived already, the time that he's spent in jail, he has very little time left over, and so the cost has got to be horrendous. Is there a national cost to the death penalty at all, that if we didn't have the death penalty, how much less it would cost the nation?
Well, it depends on the state. Every state pays for it differently. Every case is different, and the costs are carried on multiple different agencies as well as levels of government. But a few studies have been done, close to 24, I believe, that give us a rough idea. I mentioned California. They spent in the neighborhood of $4 billion and executed 13 people, but North Carolina, they found that each capital case is at least $2 million more, and that doesn't include the increased cost of the prosecution or court costs. That's just defense costs for the most part. So that's an additional $2 million or more for every single case. And this adds up. It's led to tax increases on the local and the county level. It's caused budget crises where Richardson County, Nebraska decided to mortgage all their ambulances to try to execute someone. So it leads to some bizarre decisions, and it's become incredibly costly. But there's no national average because every state is wildly different. But every single study that's ever come out shows the death penalty is more expensive on every level of the process.
Right. Now, do you foresee the death penalty being done away with on a national basis, and is there any movement in that regard?
Well, I'm a conservative, so I'd like to lean towards decisions being made at the state level. I support the 10th Amendment. So that's what we're doing. We're working to repeal the death penalty on a state-by-state legislative basis. And 7 states in the past years have done so, many of which with help from my organization and our parent organization, Equal Justice USA, who's been doing this for years. So that's our plan, and we're making headway. We've got 31 states to go, and after that, I'll be looking for a new job.
So you have 31 states to go. What is your projected date of having all this resolved and every state on parity with you?
I'm not a soothsayer, so I can't predict the future. I'm very hopeful that it will be repealed. When, I have no idea. We're just going to keep our heads down and keep working hard, and we'll reach that goal when we get there.
Okay. Well, by the way, I forgot to mention, I got so engrossed in this conversation, our telephone number is 646-652-4620. We have about 7 minutes left to go on the broadcast. 646-652-4620. If you have any questions or comments, please call in. And remember, when you call in, press press the one button so we know we want to ask a question? Because we do have people on the board, but you have to press the one button to let us know that you want to ask a question. But Preston, you said you have a question.
I do have a question here. Hey, Mark. This is Preston here. I just have a question. On the Richard Glossip case, Susan Sarandon, a famous actress, actually, I guess, kind of brought this case to more of the forefront, nationally. And she's really fought to try to get this case reopened, relooked at. And the other day, because we live in Oklahoma, there was a news report, and Mary Fallin, our governor, was interviewed and asked about the Glossip case and if it was going to be relooked at before the execution date. Well, she very, just said, well, the court systems of Oklahoma have decided, so the execution is going to go through as planned. What is the, I know you all are fighting to try to get this thing done, to get it relooked at before the execution date. I mean, what is the process now? Do you have a direct line to Mary Fallin, or what can be done if something comes up to where, hey, we really need to make sure all the right people know this information so we can try to avoid this execution?
I don't have a direct line to her, and what we're relying on is the attorneys to do the good work that they've been doing since the new attorney was assigned, and also trying to apply pressure from the grassroots and the grass tops to contact the governor, ask her for a 60-day reprieve. They're not asking for much. 60 days. He's been waiting on death row for more than 17 years. So what's 60 more days if we're talking about the life of someone who may or may not be innocent? And I don't think that's asking too much. We'll continue to work these avenues until we hopefully are successful and we're able to relook at this case. But I think it's funny you mentioned Susan Sarandon. As a conservative, I don't think there's too much that she and I agree on. We could probably find thousands of things to disagree on. But there's one issue, the death penalty, that her and I, we can see eye to eye on. And I think that's something beautiful. One of the only beautiful things about the death penalty system is that this can bring both the left and right together to try to achieve common goals for the common good. And that's opposing the death penalty and repealing it.
Yeah. Are any of the candidates for president on the Republican ticket against the death penalty? And do you know of anyone that are for retaining the death penalty?
Well, on the Republican side, Rand Paul has talked about the wrongful convictions, the problems with DNA and forensic evidence. He hasn't said that he's necessarily against the death penalty, but he's certainly not said that he supports it. So I have an inkling that he's very uncomfortable and likely opposed.
Okay.
I know Ted Cruz, when he was an attorney, he represented someone who was wrongly convicted and got them off of death row. He now says he supports the death penalty, but that may be a political decision as opposed to something that his heart of hearts is telling him what to do.
You think it's more popular from a political point of view to say that you're for the death penalty because you're being tough on crime?
No, not necessarily. I think that's what he believes. But if you say, I oppose the death penalty because I don't want innocent lives to die, I'm fiscally responsible, and I don't think it's representative of a limited government, I think that resonates with voters.
Yeah,
this
right.
is the same government that gave us the DMV, the U.S. Postal Service, and the Obamacare website.
Right.
Do you want them to run the death penalty system? I don't think so.
Well, why are so many conservatives then so pro-death penalty then?
Well, not all of them are. I mean, I think Jeb Bush is another who's very uncomfortable with the death penalty. I believe he's Catholic, so it goes against his religion. But he's also said things in the past that as a governor, he did sign them, but he signed them because it was a constitutional requirement and that the juries made the decision, not him. So I think he believes that it's very problematic and sees the folly in the system. But it's also recognized that many politicians are, they're a little bit older. They've been around in politics in the 80s and 90s when this horrible tough-on-crime mindset came about and has been so disastrous. So I think part of it is a direct correlation to that, and also ignorance of what the death penalty actually does. I don't think they realize how expensive it is and how many people get hung up on it, and the issues surrounding race and economic standing, not to mention it doesn't actually provide any sort of benefit. So
right.
We need to continue to educate people.
Well, I guess the governor then in every state, if they can unilaterally overturn a death penalty plea.
Some states I think have that ability. I'm not sure which off the top of my head, but many don't. I mean, in Texas, Rick Perry, he's not allowed to just take someone off of death row. It actually has to go through a commission, and they're allowed to look into whether they should take them off of death row or not. So it's actually not up to him. Although I think in the background, as a former governor, when he was governor at the time, he probably had a lot of sway with that commission since he appointed him.
I would imagine so. Yeah, I would imagine if he's really against it and he wants it overturned, it'll get overturned. Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much for being on our program. This has been a fabulous conversation, stimulating conversation. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot from it. I'd like to give you the last minute or two to sum things up and maybe tell people about your organization and how they can contact you if you wish to do so.
Well, I appreciate it. I encourage them to go to conservativesconcern.org and sign up to get our monthly emails. We don't inundate you. We just keep you updated on a monthly basis. If they have any questions for me directly, send an email to info@conservativesconcern.org. And as you grapple with whether or not you can support the death penalty, I always like to leave listeners with one question. Don't ask yourself, do some people deserve to die? Ask yourself, do you trust an error-prone government to fairly, efficiently, and properly administer this program? And I think the answer to that is a resounding no.
Very good. Mark, thank you so much for being on our program. We certainly do appreciate it, and good luck to you. Folks, this is the end of today's program. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, as my wife would say, you are either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.